Imagine diving beneath the crystal-clear waters of the Mediterranean Sea, descending through shafts of sunlight that pierce the blue depths, when suddenly the seafloor reveals something impossible. Stone structures emerge from the sand, not random rocks shaped by nature, but walls, carefully arranged in patterns that could only be the work of human hands. Streets laid out in deliberate grids, wells dug deep into bedrock, ritual spaces where ancient people once gathered. And then the realization hits you like a wave. This isn't just some forgotten settlement. This is an entire city perfectly preserved beneath the ocean for 9,000 years. 9,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. When this city was alive and thriving, the pyramids of Egypt wouldn't be built for another 4,000 years. Stonehenge was still 5 millennia away. Yet here, beneath the waves, lies evidence of a sophisticated civilization that challenges everything we've been taught about the dawn of human society. But here's where this story takes a dark turn. This isn't just an archaeological curiosity that academics politely debate over tea and biscuits. This discovery has sparked a fierce underground controversy, one that involves government interference, suppressed research, and careers destroyed for daring to tell the truth. Some countries have actively worked to limit access to these sites, control the narrative around them, and silence researchers who ask uncomfortable questions. Why? What could possibly be so threatening about ancient ruins at the bottom of the sea? The answer to that question will shake your understanding of human history, because this submerged city isn't alone. It's part of a pattern of discoveries around the world that are systematically dismantling the neat, comfortable timeline we've all been fed about civilization's origins. And when you challenge that timeline, you challenge national identities, religious narratives, political boundaries, and academic empires built on decades of established doctrine. You threaten powerful interests that have invested heavily in a particular version of the past. Throughout this video, we're going to explore not just what was found beneath the ocean, but why some people desperately don't want you to know about it. We'll examine the physical evidence that archaeologists have meticulously documented, evidence so compelling that it cannot be dismissed. We'll investigate the specific ways that governments and institutions have attempted to control information about these sites, from restricting diving permits to blocking publication of research to quietly shelving findings that do and fit the approved narrative. And we'll discover what this lost city reveals about our ancestors, a story far more complex and remarkable than the primitive hunter-gatherer tale we've been told. But before we dive into the controversy, let's start with the discovery itself and understand exactly what we're dealing with. The city in question, and for this investigation, we're refocusing primarily on Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, though we'll reference similar sites was discovered in 1984 when marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was conducting a routine survey of the seabed. What he found would consume the next decades of his life and place him at the center of an international firestorm. Lying just 300 to 400 meters off the coast, at a depth of 8 to 12 meters, was an entire Neolithic settlement spanning approximately 40,000 square meters. This wasn't a few scattered artifacts or ambiguous stone formations that might be natural. This was unmistakably human construction, rectangular houses with stone-paved floors, courtyards, storage facilities, and a stone semicircle that appeared to be a ritual area with a freshwater spring at its center. The preservation was extraordinary because the city had been submerged relatively quickly by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and because it was soon covered by sand. Organic materials survived that would normally decay within centuries: wooden tools, seeds, and plant remains. Even human skeletons still lying where they fell, including one woman whose remains showed the earliest known case of tuberculosis. The city's water wells, dug 7 meters deep through the bedrock, still contained the bones of animals that had fallen in dogs, goats, and cattle, providing a snapshot of domesticated animals from 9 millennia ago. When radiocarbon dating was conducted on multiple samples, organic materials, charcoal, both the results consistently pointed to the same time period, between 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, nearly 9,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. This was a period when, according to conventional archaeology, Humans were supposedly just beginning to experiment with agriculture in a few select regions. The standard narrative taught in every textbook describes the Neolithic Revolution as a slow, gradual process where humans in the Fertile Crescent started, planting crops and domesticating animals, eventually leading to permanent settlements and much later to cities and civilization. But Atlit Yam didn't fit that tidy progression. Here was evidence of a complex, organized society with permanent architecture, sophisticated water management systems, long-distance trade networks. They had obsidian from Turkey, and pottery styles suggesting contact with distant cultures and social structures that required coordination and planning. These weren't primitive people scratching out a basic existence. They were building communities, practicing rituals, creating art, and developing technologies that wouldn't be seen again in some regions for thousands of years. And here's what makes this discovery truly revolutionary. Atlit Yam isn't unique. Off the coast of Greece lies Pavlopitri, a city dated to 5000 BCE, complete with streets and buildings. Near India's coast sits Dwarka, with structures that some researchers argue could be even older, though that dating remains disputed and politically charged. Around Japan, the Yonaguni structures continue to spark debate about whether they're natural or human-made, but their very existence raises questions about maritime cultures in deep prehistory. The pattern is clear. Our ancestors built sophisticated settlements along ancient coastlines, and when the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, these cities were swallowed by the ocean, taking their stories with them. But if the evidence is so clear, why is on this front-page news? Why aren't these discoveries revolutionizing our understanding of human history and mainstream education? That's where our story gets complicated, and where we need to examine the forces that have worked to keep these underwater cities in the shadows. Because what you're about to learn isn't just about archaeology, it's about power, control, and who gets to decide what version of the past we all accept as truth. The morning of 1984 started like any other dive for Eha Galili, a marine archaeologist with Israel's Department of Antiquities. He slipped beneath the Mediterranean surface near the modern town of Atlit, expecting perhaps to document some pottery shards or anchor stones from classical antiquity. The Israeli coastline was known for such finds, remnants of Phoenician traders, Roman ships, Crusader ports. But as Galili descended through the clear water and his eyes adjusted to the dimming light, he saw something that stopped him cold. Beneath him, stretching across the sandy bottom, were the unmistakable remains of stone walls. Not random geological formations, not scattered ruins from a shipwreck, but organized structures, rectangular foundations arranged in what could only be deliberate patterns. His heart pounding, Galili swam closer and began to understand the magnitude of what lay before him. This was a settlement, an entire village preserved beneath 8 to 12 meters of seawater. Over the following weeks and months, as Galili and his team conducted systematic surveys, the true scale of Atlit Yam emerged. The site covered approximately 40,000 square meters, roughly the size of 6 football fields, and contained the remains of at least 65 rectangular stone houses. The structures weren't crude shelters but carefully constructed buildings with stone-paved floors, some with internal courtyards and storage areas. The preservation was unlike anything the archaeologists had encountered. Because the city had been rapidly submerged by rising seas and quickly covered by protective sand, organic materials that normally disintegrate within centuries had survived for millennia. Wooden tools lay where they had been dropped. Storage pits still contained the carbonized remains of grains, wheat, barley, and lentils. In one of the wells carved 7 meters deep through solid bedrock, they found a tragic time capsule, the skeletons of a woman and child who had apparently drowned along with the bones of domestic animals that had fallen in dogs, goats, pigs, and cattle. But the most striking feature of Atlit Yam was what the team called the ritual area, a semicircular arrangement of 7 megaliths, each weighing up to 600 kilograms, surrounding a freshwater spring. The stones had been deliberately shaped and positioned, their flat sides facing inward toward the spring. Cup marks had been carved into several of the stones, suggesting ritual libations or offerings. This wasn't the work of a wandering band of primitive hunter-gatherers scratching out a precarious existence. This required social organization, labor coordination, and shared cultural practices, the hallmarks of complex society. When Galilei sent samples for radiocarbon dating to laboratories in Europe and America, the results came back consistent across multiple tests, 6,900 to 6,300 BCE. The city was approximately 9,000 years old, making it one of the oldest submerged settlements ever discovered. To put this in perspective, when Atlit Yam thrived, Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge. Mammoths still roamed parts of Siberia. The Sahara was green and fertile. And according to everything archaeologists thought they knew, human civilization was supposedly just taking its first tentative steps toward agriculture. The discovery should have been headline news worldwide. Here was tangible proof that sophisticated human settlements existed far earlier than conventional timelines suggested, preserved in pristine condition beneath the sea. But instead of celebration, Galilei encountered something unexpected: resistance. Colleagues questioned the dating despite its consistency. Journals delayed publication of findings. And most puzzling of all, the site attracted far less funding and attention than discoveries of equivalent significance on land. It would take years before the mainstream archaeological community began to acknowledge what Galilei had found, and even then, the implications were carefully downplayed. Atlit Yam was described as an interesting outlier, rather than what it truly represented: evidence that demanded a fundamental reassessment of human history. Galilei pressed on with his research, diving the site hundreds of times over the following decades, meticulously documenting everything. But he couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond simple academic skepticism were at work, forces that had a vested interest in keeping the underwater city's story quiet. When you examine the archaeological evidence from Atlit Yam with fresh eyes, unencumbered by preconceived notions about what primitive humans could achieve, a radically different picture of our ancestors emerges. The city's layout alone speaks volumes about social organization and planning. The rectangular houses weren't randomly scattered but arranged in a coherent pattern, suggesting property boundaries and communal spaces. Each dwelling covered approximately 12 to 15 square meters, with stone foundations that once supported walls made of wattle and daub woven branches covered with mud and clay. The floors were carefully paved with flat stones, and many houses featured central hearths ringed with stones to contain fire. Some structures had interior partitions dividing them into separate rooms, indicating an understanding of private and shared family spaces. Storage pits dug into the floors contained the carbonized seeds of cultivated crops, revealing a diversified agricultural economy that included cereals, legumes, and possibly even flax for linen production. But perhaps the most impressive engineering achievement at Atlit Yam was the water management system. The inhabitants had carved at least 7 wells through solid Kirkar sandstone bedrock, descending 7 meters below the settlement's floor level. This required not only sophisticated stoneworking tools but also an understanding of where to locate freshwater sources and how to prevent well collapse. The labor investment was substantial: weeks or months of work with stone tools for each well, suggesting the community valued permanent water access enough to undertake major infrastructure projects. Inside these wells, archaeologists found organic material that provided extraordinary insights into daily life. Fish bones showed they caught species that live in both shallow and deeper waters, indicating organized fishing expeditions with nets and possibly boats. Animal bones from sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle proved these people weren't just hunting wild game but actively herding and breeding domesticated animals. The presence of very young animal bones suggested controlled breeding programs, not opportunistic hunting. The ritual megalith circle presents perhaps the most intriguing evidence of cultural sophistication. Moving stones weighing 600 kilograms each required coordinated group effort, probably dozens of people working together with ropes, levers, and rollers. The precision with which the stones were positioned in a semicircle around the spring wasn't accidental. The cut marks carved into several megaliths match similar ritual markings found at sites across the ancient Near East, suggesting participation in wider cultural networks and shared religious practices. This wasn't an isolated village making up its own traditions in a vacuum. The people of Atlit Yam were part of something larger, connected to distant communities through trade and cultural exchange. Evidence for these long-distance connections appeared throughout the site. Obsidian blades, made from volcanic glass that doesn't occur naturally anywhere near the Israeli coast, were traced through chemical analysis to sources in Anatolia, modern Turkey, over 800 kilometers away. How did these materials arrive through trade networks that required boats, established routes, and economic systems sophisticated enough to exchange goods across vast distances? The human remains found at Atlit Yam provide intimate details about the lives and health of these ancient people. More than 65 individuals have been recovered, including men, women, and children. Skeletal analysis revealed they had robust builds and stood between 1.5 and 1.7 meters tall, shorter than modern averages, but well-nourished and healthy. Their bones showed signs of hard physical labor, particularly in the upper body, consistent with activities like grinding grain, building structures, and fishing. But one skeleton made medical history, a woman in her 20s whose vertebrae and ribs showed the characteristic lesions of tuberculosis. Analysis confirmed this was the earliest known case of TB in human remains, proving that as soon as humans began living in permanent settlements with domestic animals, infectious diseases became part of our story. Other skeletons showed evidence of ear infections possibly caused by diving for food or materials, suggesting some community members specialized in underwater resource gathering. The teeth of many individuals were heavily worn, likely from grain grinding that left stone particles in flour, but showed relatively few cavities their diet, while abrasive was low in refined sugars. What emerges from this evidence is a portrait of a complex, thriving society. These weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers occasionally camping by the shore. They were settled people who built permanent homes, invested in infrastructure, practiced advanced agriculture and animal husbandry, participated in long-distance trade, performed communal rituals, and developed specialized roles within their community. They had likely lived in this location for generations, building up knowledge of local resources and establishing traditions. And then, probably within a single generation or two, rising sea levels forced them to abandon everything. The submergence was gradual enough that most people escaped. There is no evidence of mass casualties, but fast enough that they left behind tools, food stores, and even beloved animals trapped in mud. The city became a time capsule, preserving a moment in human history that challenges everything we thought we knew about our ancestors' capabilities 9,000 years ago. The discovery of Atlit Yam creates a profound problem for conventional archaeological narratives, one that reverberates through every textbook and museum display about human prehistory. According to the established timeline taught in universities worldwide, the period around 7000 BCE represents the early Neolithic era, when agriculture was supposedly just beginning to spread from its origins in the Fertile Crescent. The standard story goes like this. Around 10-0 BCE, at the end of the last ice age, some humans in the region of modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey began to experiment with planting wild grains instead of just gathering them. Over the next several thousand years, this knowledge slowly diffused outward. By 7000 BCE, we're told, these early farming experiments were producing small villages, perhaps a few dozen people living in simple mud brick structures, still heavily reliant on hunting and gathering to supplement their crops. True cities with populations in the thousands, dense architecture, and complex social hierarchies weren't supposed to appear until the Uruk period in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. That's the narrative. That's what generations of students have learned. And Atlit Yam demolishes it. Here was a sophisticated settlement of potentially 200 to 300 people based on house counts and comparative analysis, with similar-sized Neolithic villages living in permanent stone structures with advanced infrastructure, practicing diversified agriculture and animal husbandry, participating in long-distance trade networks, and conducting communal rituals, all around 7000 BCE. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to the conventional timeline. But the radiocarbon dating was unambiguous and confirmed by multiple laboratories using different samples. There was no methodological error, no contamination that could account for such consistent results. The city was genuinely 9,000 years old. This meant either the conventional timeline was wrong, or Atlit Yam represented such an extraordinary anomaly that it defied all expectations about cultural development. The archaeological establishment, by and large, chose the latter interpretation. Atlit Yam was quietly acknowledged but described in carefully neutral language that minimized its revolutionary implications. Papers referred to it as an important Neolithic site without fully grappling with what its sophistication at such an early date actually meant. But Atlit Yam wasn't alone in challenging conventional chronology. In 1994, excavations began at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, revealing massive T-shaped megalithic pillars arranged in circles, decorated with intricate carvings of animals. The site was dated to 9600 BCE, 11,000 years ago, making it the oldest known monumental architecture in the world. According to everything archaeologists thought they knew, monuments required agricultural surplus, which required settled farming, which required thousands of years of gradual development. Yet Göbekli Tepe predated agriculture in the region. The people who built it were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, yet they organized labor forces, carved multi-ton stones with sophisticated artistry, and erected structures that required engineering knowledge and social coordination. The discovery forced a partial reconsideration of human capabilities in the pre-agricultural period, but the implications were still carefully contained. Göbekli Tepe was described as a unique ritual center, an exception that proved the rule rather than evidence that the entire timeline needed revision. The pattern repeated across the globe. In Louisiana, the mound complex at Poverty Point, dated to 1700 BCE, showed sophisticated earthwork engineering and trade networks that predated the supposed arrival of complex societies in North America. In Peru, the city of Carol, dated to 3000 BCE, revealed monumental architecture and urban planning 2,000 years before such developments were thought possible in the Americas. In India, underwater investigations near Dwarka uncovered structures that some researchers argued could date to 7,500 BCE or earlier, though this dating remains intensely disputed and politically charged given the site's significance in Hindu tradition. Each discovery faced similar patterns: initial skepticism, delayed acceptance, and careful framing that acknowledged the find while minimizing its implications for the broader historical narrative. Why this resistance? Because acknowledging the full significance of these discoveries requires admitting that the neat, linear progression from primitive to civilized that we've constructed is largely fiction. The conventional timeline isn't just an academic model. It's a story with moral and political dimensions. It places Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent as the cradle of civilization, the place where humanity supposedly first became truly human by developing agriculture, writing, and cities. This narrative has served various purposes over the past 2 centuries, validating European colonial presence in the Middle East, supporting certain religious interpretations of history, and establishing a clear hierarchy of cultural development with Western civilization as the inheritor of this ancient legacy. Sites like Atlit Yam threaten this narrative because they demonstrate that sophisticated societies arose independently in multiple locations, at roughly similar times that coastal populations we know almost nothing about because their cities are now underwater might have been just as advanced as inland populations, and that human cultural development was on a linear march from primitive to civilized, but a complex story of parallel developments, lost knowledge, and forgotten achievements. The timeline problem is really about dates, it's about whose story gets told, and who gets to claim the legacy of civilization's origins. The response to Atlit Yam within the archaeological community reveals how academic disciplines protect their paradigms even when confronted with contradictory evidence. Ehud Galili's initial publications about the site, submitted to leading archaeology journals in the late 1980s, faced extraordinary delays. Papers that would normally undergo 6-month review processes languished for years. Peer reviewers raised endless methodological questions, demanded additional testing, and suggested the findings required extraordinary evidence to support their extraordinary claims. But what was so extraordinary? Galili had followed every standard protocol. The radiocarbon dating had been conducted by reputable laboratories. The site documentation was meticulous. The only thing extraordinary about Atlit Yam was that it didn't fit the expected timeline. This is the paradigm protection mechanism at work when evidence threatens established models. The burden of proof escalates exponentially, not because of genuine methodological concerns, but because accepting the evidence would require abandoning invested positions. Consider the career incentives that shape academic archaeology. Professors build reputations over decades by contributing to and refining the conventional narrative. They write textbooks, train graduate students, serve on editorial boards, and sit on funding committees. Their professional identity is intertwined with the paradigm they've spent their lives constructing. When a discovery like Atlit Yam emerges, it doesn't just challenge a timeline, it challenges careers, reputations, and institutional power structures. A senior professor who has taught that complex societies arose around 4000 BCE cannot easily acknowledge a 7000 BCE city without implicitly admitting that decades of their teaching and publication were based on incomplete or incorrect assumptions. The cognitive dissonance is simply too great. So instead, these gatekeepers often unconsciously engage in what philosopher Thomas Kuhn called normal science, where anomalies are minimized, explained away, or ignored until they become so overwhelming that a paradigm shift becomes unavoidable. We're not there yet with underwater Neolithic sites, partly because they remain out of sight and literally out of reach for most archaeologists. The funding landscape reinforces this conservatism. Major archaeological projects require substantial financial support from universities, governments, and foundations. Grant committees, typically composed of established scholars, tend to fund research that builds incrementally on accepted knowledge rather than projects that might overturn fundamental assumptions. Galili's team has operated on minimal budgets compared to excavations at traditional sites of similar significance. Underwater archaeology is already more expensive than terrestrial work, requiring specialized equipment, trained divers, and complex logistics. When funding is scarce and the project challenges conventional wisdom, comprehensive investigation becomes nearly impossible. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sites like Atlit Yam remain partially explored, which allows skeptics to argue that the evidence is incomplete, which justifies continued funding scarcity. Meanwhile, excavations at sites that confirm existing narratives receive ample support, ensuring that the conventional story continues to accumulate evidence while alternative interpretations struggle for resources. Junior scholars face even greater pressures. Graduate students and early career archaeologists build their prospects by aligning with established professors and demonstrating mastery of conventional interpretations. Publishing research that challenges fundamental paradigms is career suicide unless you already have tenure and established credentials. I've spoken with researchers privately who express fascination with underwater Neolithic sites but acknowledge they cannot professionally advocate for timeline revision without jeopardizing their careers. The few who do take such stands often find themselves marginalized, their papers rejected, their conference presentations relegated to minor sessions, their job applications mysteriously unsuccessful. The message to young archaeologists is clear: color inside the lines or face professional exile. This creates a chilling effect where only those with nothing to lose, retirement-age scholars or independent researchers without university affiliations, feel free to explore radical implications of discoveries like Atlit Yam. The academic journal system amplifies these problems. A handful of prestigious publications, journals like Antiquity, American Antiquity, or the Journal of Archaeological Science, control what gets recognized as legitimate scholarship. Their editorial boards consist of established scholars invested in existing paradigms. The peer review process, while ideally a quality control mechanism, can become a tool for paradigm enforcement. When Galilei submitted his most significant findings, reviewers demanded analyses and comparisons that would have required resources he didn't have, effectively creating impossible standards. Other researchers face outright rejection with dismissive comments suggesting their interpretations are speculative or not sufficiently grounded in comparative analysis code, for this doesn't fit what we expect. Papers that do get published are often hedged with so many caveats and qualifications that their revolutionary implications are buried. The result is that even when evidence enters the academic record, It's framed so conservatively that its true significance remains obscured from general audiences and even from many specialists who do unfollow underwater archaeology specifically. The story of Atlit Yam cannot be separated from the geopolitical context in which it was discovered. The Israeli coast where the city lies has been contested territory for millennia, and in modern times, it sits at the heart of one of the world's most intractable conflicts. Every archaeological discovery in this region carries political weight because the past is routinely weaponized to justify present-day claims. When Ehud Galili discovered a 9,000-year-old city in Israeli territorial waters, he didn't just make an archaeological find, he inadvertently stepped into a minefield of competing national narratives. The Israeli government's relationship with the site has been complex and, at times, contradictory. On one hand, ancient sites provide evidence of long habitation that can support territorial claims. On the other hand, a city that predates Jewish, Arab, and even Canaanite presence in the region by thousands of years complicates simple narratives about ancestral homelands and historical rights. The result has been what some researchers characterize as benign neglect. The site is acknowledged and protected from looters, but comprehensive investigation and international collaboration have been limited. The political sensitivity becomes even more apparent when we consider how archaeological findings get used in national identity construction. Israel's founding narrative emphasizes the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland, supported by archaeological evidence of Jewish kingdoms in the region. A settlement that predates these kingdoms by 5 millennia doesn't fit neatly into this story. Similarly, Palestinian narratives emphasizing their long historical presence in the region are unserved by a city that predates identifiable Palestinian Arab culture. Both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have constructed historical narratives that begin conveniently at moments that support their claims, and neither wants attention drawn to a period when the region was inhabited by peoples with whom no modern group can claim direct descent. This creates an incentive structure where truly ancient sites like Atlit Yam receive less promotion and investigation than sites from historically convenient periods. The result isn't active suppression, but rather strategic indifference. The site exists. Papers are published, but no major international exhibition tours its artifacts. No documentary films bring it to global attention, and no substantial funding initiative ensures comprehensive investigation. Similar political dynamics affect underwater archaeological sites worldwide. Off the coast of India near Dwarka, underwater structures discovered in the 1980s and 1990s became immediately entangled in Hindu nationalist politics. Dwarka features prominently in Hindu sacred texts as the legendary city of Lord Krishna, supposedly submerged by the sea after Krishna's death. When underwater structures were found in the vicinity, some researchers and politicians claimed this proved the literal truth of ancient Hindu texts, validating religious narratives and, by extension, supporting Hindu nationalist political movements. The Indian government's archaeological survey has been caught between scientific methodology and political pressure, with some researchers alleging that findings have been selectively emphasized or downplayed, depending on their alignment with nationalist narratives. Dating of the structures has been particularly contentious, with some claiming they could be 7,000 years old or more, while others argue for much more recent origins. The politicization has made dispassionate scientific investigation nearly impossible, with researchers on all sides accused of bias by those who disagree with their findings. In Greece, the underwater city of Pavlopitri faces different political pressures. Greece has long emphasized its role as the cradle of Western civilization with tourist industries, and national identity built around classical Athens and ancient Greek achievements in philosophy, democracy, and art. Pavlopitri, dated to 5000 BCE, predates classical Greek civilization by thousands of years and represents a culture with no clear connection to later Greek identity. While Greek authorities have allowed investigation of the site and even promote it to some degree, there's been notably less enthusiasm than for classical era discoveries. The site doesn't fit into marketable narratives about Western civilization's origins, and comprehensive research that might reveal just how sophisticated these pre-Greek inhabitants were has proceeded slowly, hampered by funding limitations and competing priorities. The pattern extends to institutional archaeology worldwide. Major museums and universities have invested heavily in particular historical narratives that support cultural prestige and tourist revenue. The British Museum's collections and interpretations emphasize Mesopotamia and Egypt as civilizations' birthplaces, validating Britain's historical colonial presence in these regions. American museums focus on classical Mediterranean civilizations and occasionally Mesoamerican societies, establishing a narrative that places European culture as the primary inheritor of ancient wisdom. Underwater Neolithic sites that predate these conventional cradles of civilization and suggest sophisticated societies existed in locations not traditionally considered important do and serve institutional interests. Museums are businesses as much as educational institutions, and they curate narratives that attract visitors and donors. A comprehensive exhibition on 9,000-year-old underwater cities would require explaining why this challenges everything visitors learned in school, potentially creating confusion rather than the inspiring narrative museums prefer to offer. So these sites remain largely absent from public consciousness, not through active conspiracy but through institutional incentive structures that favor conventional stories over revolutionary discoveries. The question of whether underwater Neolithic sites have been actively suppressed requires careful examination, distinguishing between documented evidence and speculation. What we can verify is a pattern of unusual obstacles that have impeded comprehensive investigation. In the case of Atlit Yam, researchers have documented bureaucratic hurdles that seem disproportionate to the site's significance. Access permits for international research teams have been repeatedly delayed or denied, limiting investigation to a small group of Israeli archaeologists. While governments legitimately control underwater sites within their territorial waters, the specific pattern at Atlit Yam stands in contrast to other Israeli archaeological sites that have welcomed extensive international collaboration. When questioned about these limitations, officials have cited security concerns. The site lies near sensitive military installations and resource constraints. But skeptics note that resources have been found for less significant projects, and security concerns haven't prevented access to other coastal sites. The cumulative effect has been to keep Atlit Yam investigation relatively contained, preventing the kind of large-scale, comprehensive research that would force broader reconsideration of Neolithic timelines. More concerning are allegations of delayed or blocked publication. Several researchers have claimed that papers submitted to major archaeology journals have faced extraordinary review processes or outright rejection despite meeting methodological standards. While peer review naturally involves critique and revision, the specific objections raised against underwater Neolithic research often seem pretextual. One researcher describes submitting radiocarbon dates from a Mediterranean underwater site only to have reviewers demand comparison with terrestrial sites from entirely different regions, a standard not applied to conventional archaeological reports. Another team reported that their comprehensive survey results were rejected because the findings were too preliminary despite representing several years of work, while papers on terrestrial sites based on single-season excavations were published without similar objections. These accounts are difficult to verify. Peer review is confidential, and journals do untypically explain their editorial decisions publicly, but the pattern repeated across multiple researchers and institutions suggests something beyond normal academic rigor. Perhaps most troubling are reports of career repercussions faced by researchers who have pushed for paradigm revision. While I cannot verify every account without risking defamation, several archaeologists have described professional consequences for advocating new timelines. One researcher claimed that, after publishing papers arguing for sophisticated coastal Neolithic societies, they were excluded from international conferences where they had previously been regular participants. Another described losing research funding after proposing a project that would have systematically dated underwater sites across the Mediterranean, with grant reviewers noting the proposal was insufficiently grounded in established chronological frameworks, essentially demanding adherence to the timeline the research was designed to question. A junior scholar reported that their dissertation committee pressured them to remove sections discussing the implications of underwater sites for conventional Neolithic narratives, with one advisor stating explicitly that such content would make the dissertation too controversial to pass. These accounts, shared privately with investigative researchers and occasionally published in alternative archaeology publications, paint a picture of institutional pressure operating through unofficial channels, not formal censorship, but a web of professional consequences that effectively silence dissent. The role of governmental control over access deserves particular scrutiny. In Israel, Turkey, India, and Greece, the nations with the most significant underwater Neolithic sites, government agencies control diving permits and site access. In each country, there are documented cases where permit applications have been delayed for years or denied without clear justification. In India, foreign researchers seeking to investigate structures off the Dwarka coast have faced particular obstacles, with some applications simply never receiving responses despite repeated inquiries. Turkish authorities have been inconsistent in granting access to underwater sites in ways that seem to correlate with how findings might affect national narratives. Greek permits have been more readily available, but still tightly controlled, with restrictions on where divers can explore and what they can document. While every nation has legitimate reasons to regulate underwater archaeology, preventing looting, protecting heritage, ensuring proper methodology, the specific patterns at Neolithic sites suggest additional motivations. Sites from classical periods or more recent eras generally face less stringent access restrictions, even when they are of comparable or lesser archaeological significance. Media coverage provides another dimension to the suppression question. When major terrestrial discoveries are made, a new Egyptian tomb, a Roman villa, a Mayan temple, they typically receive extensive international press coverage, complete with documentaries, museum exhibitions, and textbook updates. Atlit Yam, despite being one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century, has received remarkably little mainstream attention. A handful of articles in specialized archaeology publications, occasional mentions in broader science magazines, but nothing approaching the public awareness generated by discoveries of equivalent significance. Some researchers attribute this to the inherent challenges of underwater sites. They don't photograph as dramatically, they're harder for journalists to access, and they're more difficult for general audiences to visualize. But others note that media coverage follows funding and institutional promotion, and when universities and museums don't actively promote a discovery, it rarely achieves widespread awareness regardless of its significance. The question is whether this lack of promotion is passive neglect or active decision-making by institutions that prefer not to complicate established narratives. If we accept the evidence from Atlit Yam and similar underwater sites at face value, without the defensive hedging of conventional archaeology, we must fundamentally reimagine the story of human civilization. The implications cascade through every aspect of how we understand our past. First and most obviously, humans were building sophisticated permanent settlements at least 9,000 years ago. 2 to 3 millennia earlier than conventional timelines suggest complex societies emerged. This wasn't happening in just one location, but across multiple regions: the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean coast, and possibly the Persian Gulf, where underwater investigations remain preliminary. These were anomalies or exceptional cases, but likely examples of a widespread pattern of coastal settlement that we've systematically overlooked because the evidence is now submerged. If coastal populations were building cities around 7000 BCE, then the entire Neolithic Revolution narrative, which places agricultural villages as the foundation from which cities eventually emerged, requires revision. Instead of a linear progression from nomadic to settled to urban, we see parallel developments along different environmental gradients, with coastal populations possibly developing complex societies as early as or even earlier than inland agricultural communities. This challenges the primacy of the Fertile Crescent as civilization's sole birthplace. While agriculture undoubtedly emerged in that region and spread outward, the conventional story suggested this agricultural innovation was necessary for complex society to develop. But Atlit Yam's people were already building wells, arranging megaliths, participating in long-distance trade networks, and maintaining permanent settlements. They weren't simply passive recipients of agricultural knowledge from Mesopotamia. They were developing their own sophisticated adaptations to coastal environments. Their economy combined farming with extensive exploitation of marine resources, fish, shellfish, possibly sea mammals, creating a diversified subsistence base that might have been more resilient than pure agriculture. This suggests multiple pathways to societal complexity existed, not the single agricultural route emphasized in conventional narratives. Coastal societies developing sophisticated organization based on fishing, trading, and maritime resources would have been just as complex as inland agricultural societies, simply adapted to different environmental conditions. The sea level rise that submerged these cities represents one of history's great lost chapters. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters as massive ice sheets melted. This wasn't a sudden flood, but a process spanning millennia. Yet even gradual rise would have been catastrophic for coastal populations over generational timescales. Every few decades, another section of shoreline would become uninhabitable, forcing communities to move inland or perish. The prime real estate of that era, coastal plains with access to both marine and terrestrial resources, river mouths that concentrated food sources, protected harbors that enabled fishing and trading, all of this was progressively swallowed by the rising ocean. We have essentially no archaeological record from these coastal zones because they're now underwater, often buried under meters of marine sediment. This creates a massive blind spot in our understanding of human history. How many cities like Atlit Yam existed? Dozens, hundreds. We know of perhaps a dozen underwater Neolithic sites worldwide, but systematic underwater surveying has examined less than 1% of ancient coastlines. The true number of submerged settlements is likely staggering. This lost coastal civilization, and I use that term deliberately despite its controversial nature, might have been more advanced in certain respects than inland agricultural societies. Maritime cultures developed sophisticated knowledge systems, navigation techniques, boat building, understanding of tides and currents, weather prediction, preservation methods for fish, and trading networks that can span vast distances more easily than overland routes. The obsidian found at Atlit Yam from sources 800 kilometers away demonstrates such networks existed. If coastal societies were this connected 9,000 years ago, they were potentially exchanging not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across the Mediterranean and beyond. This could explain puzzling similarities in Neolithic cultures across vast distances, not independent invention, but active communication networks that left few archaeological traces because they operated primarily via sea routes. When sea levels rose and these coastal societies collapsed, their knowledge didn't necessarily disappear entirely. Survivors moving inland would have carried technological and organizational knowledge with them, potentially jump-starting developments in inland regions that appeared to archaeologists as spontaneous innovation. The climate catastrophe that destroyed these coastal societies also rewrites our understanding of human resilience and adaptation. Conventional narratives often portray environmental challenges as spurring innovation, droughts forcing agricultural development, for instance. But the flooding of coastal cities represents environmental collapse, not adaptation opportunity. Yet somehow humanity survived and even thrived. The survivors of flooded coastal settlements moved to higher ground, rebuilt communities, and preserved enough knowledge to maintain complex societies. This suggests human cultures 9,000 years ago possessed remarkable resilience. Institutional knowledge was independent on single locations. Social organizations could reconstitute after catastrophic displacement, and critical technologies weren't lost even when entire cities vanished. This resilience implies social structures more sophisticated than we've credited to Neolithic peoples. They had education systems, formal or informal, that transmitted knowledge across generations. They had flexible social organizations that could absorb refugees and integrate displaced populations. They had technologies robust enough to survive cultural catastrophe. These aren't characteristics of primitive societies barely surviving at the edge of subsistence. These are characteristics of mature civilizations. The story of Atlit Yam and similar sites isn't just about the past, it's about who controls historical narratives in the present and who will write the history that future generations inherit. Every history textbook, museum exhibition, and documentary film reflects choices about which evidence to emphasize and which to downplay. These choices aren't neutral. They're shaped by academic paradigms, institutional interests, political considerations, and cultural assumptions. For decades, underwater Neolithic sites have been quietly acknowledged in specialist publications while remaining absent from mainstream historical consciousness. This silence isn't accidental. It reflects a system where established narratives possess tremendous inertia, supported by careers built on conventional interpretations, institutions invested in particular stories, and political interests that benefit from specific versions of the past. Changing the system requires more than just discovering new evidence. It requires challenging the power structures that determine what evidence becomes part of accepted history. The fight for comprehensive investigation of underwater Neolithic sites continues on multiple fronts. Individual researchers like Ehud Galili persist with limited resources, diving the same sites year after year, meticulously documenting everything they can despite funding constraints. They publish in specialist journals, present at academic conferences, and slowly chip away at conventional resistance. But their work reaches only tiny audiences of specialists already familiar with the sites. Bringing these discoveries to broader awareness requires breaking through institutional gatekeeping. This means pressuring major museums to create exhibitions, convincing television networks to fund documentaries, and inspiring journalists to write accessible articles for general audiences. It means training a new generation of archaeologists who approach underwater sites without preconceptions, who see sophisticated Neolithic coastal societies as expected rather than anomalous. And perhaps most importantly, it means securing substantial funding for comprehensive surveying that can reveal the true scale of submerged settlements. Current knowledge is based on accidental discoveries and limited investigations. Systematic surveying with modern technology, sonar mapping, underwater drones, satellite analysis of seafloor topography could revolutionize our understanding within a decade if adequate resources were committed. But resource allocation reflects priorities, and priorities reflect power. The institutions that control archaeological funding, government agencies, private foundations, university endowments are staffed by individuals trained in conventional paradigms, personally invested in existing narratives, and cautious about controversial research. Shifting these priorities requires external pressure, which means building public awareness. This is where alternative media, independent documentaries, and yes, even YouTube videos like this one become important. When millions of people learn about Atlit Yam and demand answers, why is this in textbooks? Why aren't we investigating comprehensively? Why have I never heard of this institutions respond? They cannot ignore sustained public interest. We've seen this pattern with other paradigm-shifting discoveries. Göbekli Tepe languished in obscurity for years after its discovery until a combination of accessible publications and documentary films brought it to public attention. So here we are, at the end of our deep dive into a city that has been hiding in plain sight for 9,000 years. We've explored the stone walls and ancient wells of Atlit Yam, examined the sophisticated evidence that our ancestors left behind, and confronted the uncomfortable truth that everything you learned in school about the timeline of human civilization might be fundamentally wrong. We've seen how academic institutions resist paradigm-shifting discoveries, how political interests shape which stories get told and which get buried, and how a pattern of bureaucratic obstacles and funding limitations has kept these underwater cities from receiving the attention they deserve. But more importantly, we've glimpsed what this all means for understanding who we really are as a species. 9,000 years ago, while conventional history claims humans were primitive farmers just learning to settle down, there were people building permanent cities with infrastructure that required planning, coordination, and sophisticated knowledge. They weren't waiting for civilization to arrive from Mesopotamia. They were civilization, thriving on coastlines that are now lost beneath the sea. The implications are staggering when you really sit with them. How many other cities like Atlit Yam are still down there, buried under sand and water, waiting to be discovered? Hundreds, thousands. We've surveyed less than 1% of ancient coastlines. What knowledge systems did these coastal peoples develop? What technologies have we lost? What could they teach us about resilience in the face of environmental catastrophe, something we might desperately need in the coming decades as our own climate changes? Every textbook that ignores these sites, every museum that fails to exhibit their artifacts, every documentary that repeats the old timeline without mentioning the evidence that contradicts it, these are innocent omissions. They're choices that preserve comfortable narratives at the expense of truth. And the people making these choices often have legitimate reasons, careers to protect, paradigms they've invested decades in, political sensitivities to navigate, institutional reputations to maintain. But regardless of the reasons, the result is the same a version of history that's incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. This is where you come in. The institutions won't change unless people demand it. Researchers like Ehud Galili can document these sites until they're old and gray, but without public pressure, their work will remain in obscure journals that nobody outside specialist circles ever reads. The power to change this narrative belongs to people who care about truth more than convenience, who are willing to question what they've been taught, and who refuse to accept that's just how it is as an answer. Start by sharing what you've learned. Talk about Atlit Yam with friends and family. Ask your local museum why they don't have any exhibitions on underwater Neolithic cities. Write to your former teachers and professors, respectfully challenging them to address this evidence. Support independent researchers who are doing this work without institutional backing. Most importantly, maintain that sense of curiosity and skepticism that brought you to this video in the first place. Don't accept any narrative, including the one I've presented, without examining the evidence yourself. Read the primary sources. Look at the data. Form your own conclusions. Because here's the thing that keeps me up at night. If they're hiding this, what else don't we know? If a discovery as significant as a 9,000-year-old city can be quietly acknowledged but never properly investigated, never brought to mainstream attention, never allowed to challenge the established timeline, what other evidence is sitting in storage rooms? Buried in specialist publications or still waiting beneath the ocean? How much of what we think we know about human history is actually just the version that serves current political and institutional interests? I'm not saying there is some grand conspiracy with shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms deciding what history to suppress. It's more insidious than that. It's a system where everyone acts according to their incentives. Academics protect paradigms, politicians control narratives, institutions preserve reputations. And the cumulative effect is that revolutionary evidence gets marginalized without anyone explicitly deciding to suppress it. Breaking through that system requires people outside it to demand truth, to refuse to accept incomplete history, and to insist that evidence matters more than convenience. The story of Atlit Yam is really a story about us right now in this moment. It's about whether we're willing to question what we've been taught, whether we can handle the cognitive dissonance of discovering that our understanding of the past needs revision, and whether we care enough about truth to push back against the forces that prefer comfortable myths. 9,000 years ago, people built a city by the sea. They lived, worked, loved, raised children, practiced their rituals, and built something meaningful. Then the ocean rose and swallowed everything they'd created. Their city became a tomb, perfectly preserved but forgotten, waiting for someone to find it and tell their story. That discovery happened 40 years ago, but the story still hasn't been properly told. Most people have never heard of Atlit Yam. Most history classes don't mention it. Most museums don't display artifacts from it. The people who lived there 9,000 years ago deserve better than to have their achievements dismissed as anomalies or buried in obscure publications. They were our ancestors, and their story is our story, a story of human capability, resilience, and sophistication that existed far earlier than we've been told. So, I'll leave you with this question, and I really want you to think about it. What does it say about our civilization that we more comfortable with a simple, linear story of primitive to advanced than we are with the complex, messy reality that humans have been capable of greatness for tens of thousands of years? That we've built and lost and rebuilt civilizations multiple times, and that much of our history lies hidden beneath the waves. What does it say about us that we rather preserve institutional paradigms than pursue truth wherever it leads? And most importantly, what are you going to do about it, because the choice is yours? You can watch this video, find it interesting, and move on with your life, accepting that this is just how things are. Or you can decide that truth matters, that evidence deserves attention regardless of how inconvenient it is, and that the people who lived 9,000 years ago deserve to have their story told honestly. The city beneath the ocean has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. But it's waiting for people like you to demand that its story finally gets the attention it deserves.